In this section, we'll look how the women's rights movement exploded in the 1960s. I should note first, however, that a precursor to the movement came in the late 40s when Simone de Beauvoir published a best-selling book in 1949, The Second Sex. The author was an existentialist, and she defined women as sort of the other in society. And what she ended up doing in multi-volumes was documenting the oppression that women had faced throughout the centuries. Certainly, the women that were going to fight for equal rights in the 1960s had inspiration from a number of sources. The women's rights fighters of the 19th century, people like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others were certainly on their minds. But keep in mind that the 1960s was also the period of the African American civil rights movement. African Americans were stressing equality, and it's not a far jump from saying, well, if blacks could be independent, women should be as well. So there was a lot of overlap in the African American civil rights movement and the American women's movement. Certainly, the American women's movement adopted some of the tactics of the African American civil rights movement, the mass marches, and you can see here in this picture the clenched fist, which is symbolic of more militancy. I should note as well, however, that there was some split in the African American civil rights movement regarding women. Some of the younger African American civil rights activists saw the job for leading the movement reserved to men, and saw women as sort of diversifying or taking away some of the momentum from their own goals. So it was a complex relationship. The fight for equality of women first began to appear politically early in JFK's administration, a rather ironic occurrence because JFK was, of course, your prototypical playboy. But to offset such criticism, in 1961, Kennedy appointed the President's Commission on the Status of Women, and it was headed by the ex-First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. It included a number of prominent women. It was the first effort by the U.S. government ever to examine the role of women in U.S. life. The President's Commission studied for a couple years and issued a report in 1963 that noted the inequities and discrimination and further spurring on activism. It concluded that in private employment in such government programs as Social Security, sex discrimination was very similar to race discrimination. The Commission's 1963 report led to legislation that same year, the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Although it really wasn't adequately enforced, it did constitute the nation's first ever legislation to outlaw discrimination on gender grounds. It is still one of the few nation's laws that exclusively deals with gender discrimination. Women began to complain that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission wasn't handling sexual discrimination cases, and as a result, by 1964, you do begin to see the EEOC begin to investigate charges of gender discrimination in the workplace. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which explicitly outlawed discrimination based on race, color, and creed, also included gender discrimination. It was added, however, only by opponents who figured it would make the act look ridiculous to most Americans and would help defeat it. Women's groups, however, got the law passed with that provision in it and then promised Johnson they wanted it adequately enforced. The biggest factor probably spurring on the growth of American feminism was the publication in 1963 of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. It became an instant bestseller, eventually selling more than 1 million copies and went through 16 printings, and it was translated into 13 languages. Friedan was a middle-class girl from Illinois who won Phi Beta Kappa at Smith College, went on to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, but decided against going for a doctorate because her boyfriend frowned on it, and society said it was just too competitive. She got married and had kids, and she was happy, but she really wasn't completely satisfied, and then she decided to write the book. The book essentially called on women to enter the mainstream of American society and to fight for equality. She interviewed hundreds of women who said they had everything they were supposed to have, but they still weren't fulfilled. Sort of like, is this all? She blamed psychologists and Freudian psychoanalysis especially Friedan clearly had touched a nerve. She said she loved her husband, she loved her kids, she realized what she's doing important, but is this all? With the book's success, Friedan, she clearly hit a nerve, and she went on the lecture circuit backing up her conclusions. She had found a huge constituency, middle-class women who, maybe flowing from the experiences in World War II, somehow just felt unfulfilled. They weren't independent. They felt like they could do so much more. With the popularity of the Feminine Mystique and dismayed by the reluctance of the EEOC to address adequately gender discrimination, Friedan and others created the National Organization for Women, which had a nice acronym NOW, in 1966. It defined itself as a civil rights group for women, clearly taking its impetus from the African American civil rights movement. Efforts would include lobbying the government, filing lawsuits, and mobilizing public opinion. Its constitution, which was completed several years later, called for enactment of the Equal Rights Amendment, which had of course first been proposed in the 1920s and had been proposed ever since but was still not passed Congress, and also access to legal abortion, among other provisions. The abortion issue, abortion was illegal in all states except when the mother's life was in danger. With the support of many young activists and college-educated women, NOW's membership skyrocketed quickly. NOW didn't want to create a war of sexes, not to put down sex relations with men, or the concept of motherhood. She just stressed that it was important to have women to have choices and to have options. Later, in the 1970s, I should note, more radical women began to emerge, and this was very indicative of the African American civil rights movement, the late 60s and whatnot. Some of the more radical women's groups included the Red Stockings. It was a group which pledged to have nothing to do with men in their private lives, and whose rhetoric was more heated. They talked about male chauvinist pigs, and even some claimed that heterosexual sex itself was oppressive. Friedan was appalled by these spin-off radicals in the late 60s and 70s and sort of lobbied against them. When radicals began to adopt the term feminist, Friedan and others began using the term women's liberation. Today, of course, some conservatives still try to conjure up these radicals to describe all women activists. You hear the phrase radical feminist, for example. By the late 60s, certainly most women weren't to that point of being man-haters, but the feminism movement had adopted more direct protest and more radical techniques, just like the African American movement. In 1968, feminists crowned a live sheep Miss America to dramatize, that such contests degraded women. You begin to see them invading all male clubs and bars. They discriminated against advertisements that portrayed women as sex objects, protesting such words as chick or gal. They set in at lawyer associations and medical societies to call attention to discrimination against women in professional careers. Probably the most famous of all their protests was when they burned their bras into a Freedom trash can. That was sure to bring the cameras. In the late 60s, planning began for the so-called Women's Strike for Equality. It was to take place in August 1970, and it was to commemorate the 50th anniversary of women's suffrage. It was the largest women's demonstration ever, and it included tens of thousands of women parading down New York City's Fifth Avenue. By the late 60s and early 70s, you do begin to see at least the beginnings of some of these efforts paying off. By 1970, over 40% of the women held full-time jobs. There was still pay inequity, but it was slowly decreasing. Of course, it still exists today. Anyway, there had been hundreds of lawsuits that led to the end of official business codes that discriminated. For example, financial institutions were more willing to issue credit to single women and women who were married but kept their name. Colleges and universities had agreed to equal pay scales for female faculty, which was given significant pay increases to women in that realm. You see the end of newspaper practices of listing jobs by heading male or female, like a waiter or a waitress. Importantly, it led to new government guidelines that required corporations receiving federal funds to adopt non-discriminatory hiring practices on equal pay scales. So this is the beginning of some of the payoff of the women's rights movement in the 1960s. This includes this section on the women's movements and its some of its successes into the 1960s.